All right, you know what? We're just going to dive right in. Allow me to set the scene. It is 1922. Fuck yes. You are in a performance hall, not altogether unlike this one. On the stage is nothing but this huge screen painted with this huge face, and where the mouth should be is a hole cut out. Now, behind the screen, where you can't see, is a 6-piece orchestra and a tall, bejeweled woman sitting on top of a stepladder, holding something that looks like a traffic cone, and she is prepared to shout at you through this traffic cone for the next 2 hours for her performance called Facade. This woman is basically like if Lady Gaga and Tilda Swinton were combined and then took a time machine back to the 1920s to dominate the literary scene. She was one of the most eccentric, polarizing, and utterly fascinating features of the 20th century, Dame Edith Sitwell. Now, as a sidebar, I wrote that whole Tilda Swinton line before I learned that Tilda Swinton actually did do an homage to Edith for W Magazine in 2018. You should absolutely look up the photos. They are gorgeous. And then I learned that Tilda Swinton is Edith's real-life cousin, no joke. Art is wild. All right, back to Facade. The critics thought it was bullshit. But before we can talk about that, we actually have to go back in time to Edith's childhood. We need to visit Derbyshire to discover how she became a legendary eccentric. Edith was born in 1887, and her early childhood here at Renishaw Hall, love that for you. So yeah, her early childhood here was, to put it mildly, a horror show. Her father, Sir George Sitwell, was also a famous eccentric. He was one of those really great guys who thought that education for girls made them unwomanly, and he refused to send Edith to school. He also placed a sign at the entrance to their home, which read, "I must ask anyone entering the house never to contradict me or differ from me in any way, as it interferes with the functioning of gastric juices and prevents me sleeping at night." I told y'all he was a really great guy. Her mother, Lady Ida, here in white, was an unhinged alcoholic. And in one particularly bananas moment, Edith was sent to pawn Ida's fake teeth to buy her mother brandy. Good parenting. We love that. Ida unleashed horrifying rages every day onto Edith. And one biographer wrote, "There is no more important fact in Edith Sitwell's early life than her mother did not want her." Now, despite a childhood that rivaled the storyline from the movie Mommy Dearest, Edith grew and became a woman who is nothing short of a walking art installation. She wasn't a conventional beauty of the time. In fact, her nose was so large and misshapen when she was young that her parents made her wear a metal truss with hooks up her nostrils and like leather strapping around her head to try to correct its shape. She was also a towering 6 feet tall. But Pablo Picasso, yes, that Picasso, the artist, said of her face, "It's a collector's piece." And Cecil Beaton, the renowned photographer and painter, described her as a tall, graceful scarecrow. So basically the opposite of me. She became known for her elaborate outfits, which included velvets, exotic rich turbans, and rings the size of ice cubes or doorknobs. Novelist Virginia Woolf described her as transparent, like some piece of bone one picks up off the moor, with seawater stones gracing her frail hands. Her outfits grew increasingly extreme over time. She was capital E eccentric, And this, combined with her, let's call them unkind words to critics, were undoubtedly part of the reason that she was judged so harshly. Get it? All right, so let's come back to 1922. Edith is 35 years old, and her performance, Facade, has just debuted, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. There was Edith behind the curtain, like some tall, turban-bedecked Wizard of Oz, vocalizing through a thing called a sengerphone, which is a glass megaphone, and it was all over this absurd caterwauling music. The public premiere of Facade was something that was considered a succès du scandale, which is something like a work of art that gains notoriety because of its scandalous nature. So basically, Facade was like that song Friday by Rebecca Black, or Lady Gaga's Meat Dress, or Miley Cyrus's VMA performance, or Balenciaga collab with Crocs. Like, everyone loved to hate it. Is it art, though? Is it?
If you can get away with it, yes.
Yes, man above. Was that God? Okay, debating what makes good art. I love you all so much. Debating what makes good art isn't exactly a new concept, but the critics in 1922 were pretty unified. They deemed Facade at the time basically a live performance of nonsensical words and rhythms that danced around coherence like a cat avoiding a bath. The press, as you may expect, was unkind. The Daily Graphic's headline called it "Drivel That We Paid to Hear." The Manchester Guardian wrote of a relentless cacophony, and the Daily Express loathed the work, but they did admit that it was naggingly memorable. Noel Coward, a very unfortunately named poet, stormed out in the middle of the performance, calling it pretentious nonsense. Even the orchestra didn't like it. The clarinetist asked the composer, "Has a clarinet player ever done you injury?" Now, Edith, who had a thin skin for criticism, responded, "All the pipsqueakery are after me in full squeak." And I realize that to our ears, this clapback sounds kind of tame, but at the time, it was the equivalent of Madonna saying, "I'm tough, I'm ambitious, and I know exactly what I want. If that makes me a bitch, okay." In fact, if we pan out, Edith had a lifelong talent for withering, era-appropriate put-downs. She once remarked about Virginia Woolf, "I enjoyed talking to her, but thought little of her writing. I considered her a beautiful little knitter." About fellow poet D.H. Lawrence, she said, "Mr. Lawrence looked like a plaster gnome on a stone toadstool in some suburban garden." She was savage in her criticisms, but Edith was well known for having a dual nature. She was also fiercely loyal to her friends. If we catapult ourselves forward, when Edith was 66, we find her tightly bonded with, of all people, Marilyn Monroe. A bit of a progressive thinker, instead of criticizing Marilyn for posing nude to make money, as people expected her to do, Edith actually defended her, saying, and please imagine this in a delightful English accent, "There have been nude models before now. It means nothing against a person's moral character. If people have never been poor, perhaps they don't know what it is like to be hungry." Now, as Edith grew older, her eccentricities deepened. Constant physical pain, tight finances, and hardships with friends and family, combined with a steady intake of wine and gin, took their toll. She was always angry. At one point, she proclaimed to have some clairvoyant abilities. Paranoia crept in, making her believe that everyone who ever loved her was either ignoring her needs or actively exploiting her. She became unreasonably fearful about getting ill, And so she started opening all of her letters, wearing gloves to avoid infection. Who knew some of us would be doing this in 2020, okay? In her later life, she was almost always depressed, and the way that she got out of a funk was to pick a fight. She'd write scathing letters to local publications, provoking fellow writers into lengthy back and forths. She was basically the someone's wrong on the internet meme of her time. But through it all, her work endured. Despite its original box office flop in 1922, Facade gained notoriety and a fan base and continued to be performed through the late 1970s. Plus, a full 42-track version from 1993 on something some of you may remember called a CD. For those of you who don't remember CDs, think Pandora with more plastic and fewer advertisements. And fewer songs. You can even find performances on YouTube if you would like to yourself take in what would eventually become known as one of Edith's most progressive masterpieces, filled with melodies and new rhythms, and I'm gonna be really honest, it's real confusing. These days, critics have come around to understand that Dame Sitwell used her wildly experimental piece, Facade, to drive a dying art form forward. She called the poetry that immediately preceded her flaccid, love that for her, and sought to change it. And she did, despite her eccentric and polarizing personality and shocking fashion. Sure, much like our friend Moira Rose, her eccentric appearance, withering criticisms, and sharp-tongued comments on other famous intellects of the time gained her notoriety to an extent. But it's her innovative, meticulous, prolific, and sometimes bananas art that made her one of the most influential and ingenious poets of the era, particularly when the modernist movement was almost exclusively male. So, get your glasses out, people. I can almost see them. All right, so here's the Dame Edith Sitwell, the high priestess of 20th century poetry, a woman who looked the status quo dead in the eye and said, "Not today, Satan!" May we all channel a bit of her audacity and penchant for fabulous outfits in our own lives.